live.
Hey everybody, this is First Warn Storm Team Chief Meteorologist Brad Panovich here in Charlotte, North Carolina. We're trying something different tonight. We're bringing in some of my esteemed colleagues from across the Southeast. So right now I'm in the upper left corner, and up in the upper right is Tim Buckley from WFMY in Greensboro. Bottom right, Jeff Lawson, he's the Chief Meteorologist up at WVEC in Norfolk. And down in the bottom left, if I'm correct here, is Efren Afonte, right, from Columbia. So real quickly, guys, I kind of told everybody who you are, but if you want to do a quick introduction and talk a little bit about how the storm is impacting your region, because we're spread out from Columbia, Charlotte, Greensboro to Norfolk. So let's start to the south first. The first place impacted is going to be the Columbia market. So Efren, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about what's going on down there?
Well, right now, the biggest thing that we're watching is the actual track of Dorian. The key element that we're dealing with right now is our entire South Carolina coastline to the south around the Hilton Head area, what we call the Low Country, all the way up to Myrtle Beach, which is the Grand Strand.
Closing at 5 p.m.
Impact points we're looking at. Now, the Columbia metropolitan area, which is right in the heart of South Carolina, the biggest impacts we're going to be seeing, especially starting in the next few hours, is going to be the tropical storm force winds that's going to be affecting our eastern and southern communities. And of course, they're going to be impacted of whatever comes up the coastline. The rainfall, that's going to be the other issue, as we've seen from the last two hurricanes that dropped a lot of rainfall, from Hurricane Harvey in Texas to Hurricane Florence in North and South Carolina. The biggest question we have right now is how much rain that we're going to be getting pretty much in the southeastern half of South Carolina, because history dictates that when we have anything more than 3 to 5 inches of rain at the minimum, we start flooding issues. And the reason why they call it the Low Country is it's right on the coastline. It's pretty flat, but it's not a gradual incline as you go through South Carolina. A lot of our viewing area to the south and east of Columbia is still relatively flat and close to sea level. So the biggest issue, not so much is the storm surge, but the amount of rainfall that's going to be coming down. Even if the rain isn't that much in our immediate Columbia metropolitan area, all the rain that's going to happen right along the North and South Carolina state line, from the North Carolina Piedmont to the South Carolina PD, will start flowing down into central South Carolina, and the flooding issue is going to be the biggest risk, along with the tropical storm force winds. And right now we're in a holding pattern because it hasn't started with the winds as of yet, but we're looking at right now anywhere in the next 3 to 4 hours for the winds to start picking up, and then eventually the rainfall as we get into the early morning hours tomorrow morning.
Yeah, and what about your current conditions? Like, are you guys abnormally dry? I mean, one of the things we've had with past storms is we've had kind of a precursor events that have kind of saturated everything. How are you guys in moderate drought or low end drought? Are you guys in a situation where the soil is already saturated?
The problem is that we've had rainfall really this entire summer, few and far between. Just in our Columbia city area alone, for the year, we are almost 7 inches deficit. And that is a significant amount. And considering the fact that we were almost in a similar situation back in 2015, around this time of the year, well, towards the end of September, the beginning of October, we had the historic 2015 flood. So when you're that dry, the ground really doesn't have enough time to absorb that much rain. Now, granted the fact that when we had that historical flood, we had in many areas of our viewing area over 20 inches of rainfall. It's just not enough time to absorb. So a lot of that just flash floods, and that piles up, especially when you go closer to the coastline. So the biggest problem we have with the drought is we're going to be seeing rainfall rates potentially in many areas of the northeastern, eastern, and southern portions of South Carolina, and of course, our viewing area in Columbia, that 3 to 5 inches of rain, especially all within an hour or two, is going to flood, and there's no timetable of when they'll actually absorb. So this is going to be not only a tropical wind event for South Carolina, but this is going to be a very likely flooding event. And Dorian's track is one thing that we're watching very carefully, because no matter what category rate it's going to be, we know that the amount of rainfall that it's producing right now in the Atlantic is heading our way.
Yeah, and just so everybody watching, we just got the 9 o'clock update, and nothing's really changed except for I think the big thing I've noticed it's now due north movement at 8 instead of that north northwest, and I would argue it's been moving that way for a couple hours, but sometimes the Hurricane Center waits 3 hours of a movement to average out before they kind of do it. So that's key. It's now moving due north. It's not moving west at all. Now we're waiting for that northeast turn, but what's interesting tonight, and I'm going to bring in Tim Buckley because not only does Tim work in Greensboro, but he worked in Eastern North Carolina as well, an area that's going to be heavily impacted by this and an area that we're covering. We've got crews out there as well in Atlantic Beach, the Wilmington area, and Charleston. But talk about Tim out there because you have firsthand knowledge. Storm surge potential out there is really high.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, here in the Piedmont where I'm located in Greensboro, we're still kind of trying to figure out if we're going to get rain. We're going to be right on the edge of it, right? Just like Brad and Charlotte and like Columbia, South Carolina too. We're on the edge. But Wilmington, and we've been trying to say this for a couple of days, people always focus on like that middle line of the cone. We actually took that out of our graphics because the cone is really trying to show people where the storm could make a direct hit. That's forecasting the center of the storm. It's still entirely possible that the Wilmington area, the Cape Fear region, as we call it there, really could see a landfall. It's possible. And the reason that North Carolina has a better chance of getting a landfall out of this than South Carolina or than other states really in general is we stick out like a sore thumb. We have the Cape Fear that juts out. We then have Cape Lookout, and then we have Cape Hatteras. So the Outer Banks, of course, are always at risk. And in this case, it's no different. It really is going to be riding the coast. So to me, I have a couple concerns. I was also down there reporting for us for Matthew, and Matthew was only a Category 1 at the time, but it had pushed so much water along the way. It was also one of the storms that was a Category 5 before, and it pushes a lot of water up the coast. I really think tomorrow, even tonight, you're going to see a lot of that water starting to come in from Myrtle Beach up to the Brunswick County beaches, Wilmington area. You're going to get that surge ahead of the storm when the wind is still easterly. So even if it doesn't make a direct hit, you're going to get a lot of that flooding. They're forecasting a storm surge of 4 to 7 feet. That's taller than a lot of us. So that's a big deal. And then, of course, you have the inland flooding. Wilmington's been dry this year, but, they just went through Florence last year. So there are going to be a lot of issues in Southeast North Carolina. I've been telling folks it's either a bad storm if it doesn't make a direct hit or a really bad storm if it does make a direct hit. So just be ready.
Yeah, and I think, I want to stick on the surge theme because I thought you guys both brought up two good points, not focusing on the category and really focusing on that surge, which is going to happen way before the winds come up ahead of the storm. And I'll bring in Jeff now. Jeff is up in an area probably in the most flood-prone market that we're talking to tonight. And you're probably thankful it's to yourself, but you guys cover a lot of the Outer Banks, and you know that area, the Tidewater region down into the Outer Banks, very susceptible to storm surge. What are you guys worried about up there, Jeff?
Well, it really depends, as you said. We don't cover we cover all the Outer Banks. We literally, our DMA is from Cape Hatteras all the way up to Chincoteague on the north. So, and halfway to Richmond, Williamsburg and stuff. So those areas are going to see minimal impact. The metro area, Norfolk, Virginia Beach, Hampton, etc., they have their own set of issues. And then with that sharp cutoff, whether it's winds or whatever, the farther you go down the coast, the worse things are looking. We've got a couple of issues around here that we're concerned with. Flooding, obviously, and both tidal flooding and rainfall flooding. A lot of people are noticing the similarities with this storm to Matthew. And they're saying, oh my God, Matthew was horrible here. I mean, we had areas that have literally never flooded, ever, that flooded. And it wasn't from the storm surge. It was from Hurricane Hermine, which was a few weeks or whatever beforehand, gave us 9 inches more rainfall the previous month than normal. So we had 14 inches of rain in a month. And then we added in a foot of rain 3 weeks later. So the places that had never seen anything of that, magnitude ended up high, I'm talking high areas that are, 12, 15 feet above sea level, ended up with horrific flooding. And I don't know how many thousands and thousands of homes ended up having to redo their whole first floors. This one, some of the models are having us up in that sort of a range of 5 to 10 inches. I've been pointing out and emphasizing that even if we get that, I don't think we'll have the kind of freshwater flooding that we had in terms of the issues with Matthew, because we're only 2 inches above normal for the entire summer. We're not super dry like he was talking about down in Columbia, so we're going to be able to absorb some of it. So we're a little concerned with freshwater flooding, but not nearly to the extent we were heading into Matthew. Now, tidal flooding is another issue. Matthew did not bring us much tidal flooding. I think 5.3 feet, which for us is just barely into the moderate category of tidal flooding. With this storm down to our south, we're thinking obviously, major tidal flooding, Cape Hatteras up through, maybe Manio, et cetera, where Roanoke Island is. From there up to the state line, maybe moderate to major flooding. And then in Hampton Roads itself, it'll depend partly on the wind direction and which inlets. We have some inlets where the Chesapeake Bay all gets funneled down into certain rivers and inlets, and others are somewhat protected. So we're worried about that. And of course, the winds. We're going to have winds that are 20 miles per hour at most in parts of our viewing area. And then we'll have winds that'll gust to 100 in the southern part.
Up here. Yeah, I think you've got a complex situation there where part of your viewing area is going to get probably hit pretty hard and one part is nothing. And
Right.
I think from a communication standpoint, maybe you guys can all chime in on this, is, there's so many different threats spread across such a big geographic area. How do you communicate this to people that some folks like Tim and I were, in our viewing area, there's probably half of our viewing area that probably will have no idea there's a hurricane on the coast unless they were watching it on TV. And then the eastern part of our viewing area is going to have wind and maybe some possible flooding depending on how these rain bands sets up. How have you guys been communicating this to your viewers both on air and online? And what have you found to be effective? Because I'm getting questions still that I think it's going to be another Hugo coming in the Western Carolinas. And you try to explain to people, no, this is really an Eastern Carolina event, but it's not like Matthew, but it's kind of like Matthew. It's been tough to communicate these threats. Tim, what have you been trying?
Well, I think it's always difficult just to kind of distill everything down to main threats, right? So something Brad does a really good job about is a lot of times he'll color code things. I think that's really helped. We show the computer models a lot. We show the spaghettis. They're memes now today. If you can just kind of boil things down to red, orange, and yellow, sometimes that actually makes things a little bit more simple. I think that has worked to some degree. We've certainly been highlighting that the coast is at the biggest risk, but here inland, we care about the coast, so where people are interested. I think people are really taking it pretty seriously, though, because of how spooky and insanely strong it was in the Bahamas, and they saw that Cat 5 strength right away. I do think people are taking it pretty seriously, but it is difficult to communicate just how sharp of a cutoff we're going to see, like we were talking about with the rainfall. So I've been trying to emphasize, hey, if we're either going to get no rain or we're probably going to get 2 inches. It's not going to be either or. It's just going to depend on how far inland those rain bands get, because it's heavy rain, tropical rain. So I think the folks at the coast have a much harder job because they have to try and get folks to take this seriously. And anyone who's lived through a hurricane before thinks they can do it again. And if there's a bit of a badge of honor, right? If you survive a hurricane, you kind of feel a little confident there. So I'll be very interested to see what the coastal Mets have to say about places like Wilmington and others. Are they taking it seriously or not? So that's just where
what's interesting is we had a crew in Carteret County, which I think is one of the areas that might get hit the hardest. And I was fascinated. We had to evacuate hotels twice in that location. I think they're still really shocked from what happened with Florence last year, that they're being overly cautious in that area. They don't want to see anything like that. But you're right. One of the things I always tell people is, if you're smart, you probably can survive a storm, but why would you want to stay for the aftermath? Nobody thinks about the aftermath of having to live with no services, no electricity, no AC, no running water, animals trying to crawl into your, I remember from Katrina, that was the thing I remember most, is like a lot of people that made it didn't realize how miserable the conditions would be afterwards. So I think you just gotta leave, because nobody thinks about that aftermath. It is not a good time. What about you guys in Columbia? What has been the number one question you've gotten down in the Columbia area?
When is this all going to stop? Honestly,
I think we lost your mic there for a second. All right, I can't hear you, so I'm gonna go. There we go. Try. Yeah. So Jeff, oh, there you go. Speak up a little bit. It sounds like it's really muted. Oh man, it was there for a second. Yeah. Jeff, what about you? We'll come back to you. Hopefully get that figured out. Jeff, what's been the number one question or concern that you've run into in your area?
People want to know what it's comparable to. Absolutely. Whether it's wind, whether it's, the rainfall, what's this, going to compare to? So we did a nice graphic showing, our flood of record is the 1933, Cat 1 hurricane that hit us. The only one that's ever since, 33, we've never had a direct hit here in Hampton Roads. We've had them hit the Outer Banks, come over us, but that's the record. Just under that is Isabel, 7.9 total feet above the lowest of the low tides. So we compare it to people wanting, how's this compared to Isabel? How's it compared to Irene? How's it compared to Matthew? Some of these other ones. So we give them, like right now, we're giving them a range of 6.5 to 7 total feet of water in the basin above mean low or low water. And we're saying that's, 10 to 17 inches below Matthew. People are like, oh, great. Well, I had, a foot of water in my first floor during Matthew, so they can make a comparison. In terms of like the wind damage and stuff, we say, it might be like a Bonnie that we had if people, for around here for that long, or comparing it to Isabel. There were places you mentioned being without power or water for a while. In Isabel, we had places for over a month that were many places over a month that never had electricity. And people for a year or two that were living in trailers in some of our locations. So people, want to know how it's going to compare to that. And we'll tell them, maybe in terms of the wind speeds, it might be similar, but there are, again, some major differences. With Isabel, we were extremely saturated. I don't know, we lost tens and tens and tens of thousands of trees. We're not going to lose that many in this situation. So that's been the biggest thing, is trying to sort of compare for people. And then the people that don't, we use the explainers to try to show what we're talking about.
Yeah, that's great. All right, I think we got your mic fixed, Efren. So tell us what your biggest concern from viewers in your area has been. We had it fixed. Oh no. So it doesn't seem to be working again, but I'll tell you, I'm looking at the chat. So we're getting, we're on Periscope, Facebook, YouTube. I'm getting a lot of questions from Western Carolinas about impacts in the Charlotte area. I can tell you in the Charlotte area, I don't see a lot of big impacts, and maybe Tim can chime in on this. I think that I would say from 85 west, there might be little to no impact in our area, but east of 77 towards the Sandhills, I think the Sandhill communities up in that area, central North Carolina, is the one area I have huge question marks about, Tim. If we get a heavy rain band to set up there, there could be a ton of rain or no rain.
Yeah, I'm also interested, maybe you are too, about how big does the wind field spread out?
Yeah. Does it spread out? Yeah.
Because you have this front, it's not a super strong front, but you do have a front that's kind of digging in at the same time. We saw that with Matthew, and it really, the wind field will spread out some. So I'm curious to see how high the wind gusts get. There are a couple of the models that we look at out there that are a little aggressive from time to time. So that might be a question I have, how far east or how far west does the wind get? And my biggest question still is just, I don't know how far inland the rain is going to get. I have a general idea. I think, 220 for us, I-73 for others is probably a good dividing line. I've been telling folks, if you live west of Greensboro, don't plan on a drop. If you live in Raleigh, you probably get 3 to 4 inches. And there's a gradient in between that includes Burlington and Siler City and you name it. But it's going to be a big spread, right?
Yeah. And that's the thing. You brought up the dry air on the west side. So I brought up the water vapor loop here. That's a lot of dry air. And I think that's why the questions on the west side become really interesting. I think we lost Tim. But the dry air on the west side, and Jeff, maybe you can talk about this, because there's a trough coming down in the front. And I think particularly up in your area, one thing that'll be interesting is the interaction with that trough. Could that expand the wind field way up into your area?
Absolutely. And that's another comparison with Matthew. I've been here for 30 years now and doing weather in Southeast Virginia on TV for 36. So I've seen a million of these storms come and go. And you've got, they're all different, but in some respects, there's a similarity between a lot of them where the east side gets, as you would expect, out over the water, no friction. That has all the serious winds. And then you get back over land, and we can have a Hurricane Gloria, which was a monster of a storm, come 20 miles from our coastline and not bring there wasn't a drop of rain here because that west side got eroded away so much with the dry air entrainment like you're talking. So we have a history of that. And that was why when Matthew was coming, our big question was, okay, is Matthew going to do the same? Well, it did the opposite because it was transitioning to, more of an extratropical storm or a hybrid. It turned into more of a nor'easter. And instead of having the heaviest winds right around the center, all of a sudden, like in a nor'easter, they're out closer to halfway between the high and the low, and you get, that forcing zone. And so some of the strongest winds in our area with Matthew were over our metro area and not over the southern Outer Banks. So that's something we've been concerned with, and that we've sort of gone back and forth with, is how much of that will we get in terms of the expanding wind field. But absolutely, that's why we're going a little higher. If you look at, you guys had the cone with the 39, knot winds and the hurricane force winds coming up. And those, for much of our area, we're barely in that 39, mile per hour cone. Yet we're calling for a lot of areas to have gusts, in the 50s or even up near 60. So we think the odds are higher than would be depicted there. The chance of 40 plus is what, 40? Does that say? Yeah, over the heart of my area, it's pretty much 40%. I would say it's higher than that. So we're going, 10 miles per hour, at least more than some of the guidance is going.
Yeah, I'm interested in that too, because even when Michael came up here, we had a little sting jet formed on the backside as it was becoming extra tropical, and we had stronger winds with Michael passing over us than Florence, which actually passed quicker over us. So it's kind of an interesting step. So we're getting a lot of questions at the coast, and maybe all of us can chime in on this, but a lot of questions about specific beaches. I heard Topsail Island, Ocean Isle, Morehead City. A lot of folks obviously have vacation properties at the beach. Let me just open this up for anybody. What do you guys honestly think is going to be the biggest impacted area in North or South Carolina or Virginia? Because if I had to ask me, I really think it's going to be the Outer Banks and that Carteret County, the southern part of Pamlico Sound, and possibly the Wilmington area, as Tim was talking about, if it clips that area. What do you guys think?
I completely agree. I honestly, the largest impact that I'm looking at right now, at least within the next 24 hours, is as far as South Carolina. If this continues Dorian's path, regardless of landfall or not, the two largest things we're going to be looking at least in the Myrtle Beach, Grand Strand area, heading towards areas around Carolina Beach and Wilmington, we could be looking at on the short end. We have a South Santee River that runs just south of Myrtle Beach. Inundation models are indicating possibly up to 9 feet storm surge. The amount of rainfall that a lot of models are indicating in the area of the Grand Strand, and first in South Carolina, we call it the PD, that runs right along the North and South Carolina state line, and in eastern South Carolina, some models are indicating that not only are they going to be dealing with the rainfall of 10, maybe 11 inches, but the hurricane force winds also staying between 50 and 70 miles an hour. So you've got 3 threats right now in that area of not only extreme eastern South Carolina, but of course the areas of south central and southeastern North Carolina in Tim's area.
One area I'm concerned with is the sound side flooding for us. All this water comes into the Pamlico and the Albemarle Sounds, and then the storm moves offshore and you get that switch to northwesterly, and man, do we get places like, Roanoke Island and Manio and anywhere along the Outer Banks, but on the west side, absolutely is under feet and feet of water when we get some of these storms like this. So some people, especially new to the area, don't tend to think about that because they think of the northeast wind and all that. So we are particularly concerned about some serious sound side flooding for the Outer Banks.
Yeah, I was looking at some of the guidance, some of the modeling. I'm sure you guys look at some of the storm surge modeling, Jeff, I agree. Some of the sound side flooding with it just offshore was really off the charts, like in the Havelock area down there, that was really hit by areas of Florence were hit with a ton of flooding there. At sound side flooding, it's easy to move that shallower water on the sound side than it is over on the ocean side. Sometimes it just takes that quick shift. So a lot of questions about specific locations, which is pretty common. But one of the things you get a lot of questions about is, how do people survive on the Outer Banks? I get this a lot because, there's always somebody who stays out there. And Jeff, you're really familiar with this area, but there's a lot of diehards that aren't going to leave. Well, how do they deal with it out there?
My sister-in-law and brother-in-law lived there on the Outer Banks. They have never once evacuated. And they've lived through all the storms. And it's funny, some of the storms you would think would be the worst, they're like, oh, that wasn't all that bad. And then I can't remember what storm it was, probably 4 years ago. She's like, I really wish I would have left. This was the worst storm we've ever gone through. Now they're lucky because they're up at 12 or something feet above sea level. So they don't have to worry about it, just the winds. They don't have to worry about the flooding issues. I don't know how the people put up with it and go through it that are in some of the areas around Hatteras that, I don't know.
Yeah. And Highway 12 gets rebuilt, it seems like every 6 months.
Somebody pours a Coke or a slushy out the window on the way home from 7-Eleven and you get overwash on Route 12.
Yeah, I mean it is barrier islands, and they are kind of susceptible to that. We're almost out of time here, guys. I don't want to keep everyone too long, but we're going to get a forecast update at 11. So let's do a quick around the horn. What do you guys expect to surprise you, and what do you think as far as the biggest struggle with forecasting the storm has been for you?
Yeah, I'm kind of surprised. We had such a sharp turn off of Florida. Obviously, I think that's kind of mystified the whole nation. Everyone's amazed that a storm could sit just like that, right? They say,
Tim, I think that's a very good point, because we were talking about that today. Right. Imagine the people down in Miami. That thing was like 150 miles east of them, and they weren't under any tropical products.
That's science. I mean, that's modern day of us being able to say, no, it's really not going to hit you. And that should be applauded and amazing that they didn't have to evacuate, really. And it would have been so different 10 or 20 years ago, right?
Yeah, they would have no idea. It could have been off the coast of Africa. We wouldn't have known about it until it was hitting somebody. Tim, what do you think? What do you expect to see tonight? Anything that is going to surprise you going forward?
I mean, I've been kind of amazed at how consistent the track has been. I actually posted earlier today. I said, anyone in the Carolinas should not be surprised, because the cone has been the same since Sunday. If you look at the cone, yes, there's been slight shifts west, east, if you look at the center line, but don't do that. The cone has been the same for the most part for several days. So I actually expect them to kind of keep it the same. I think the Outer Banks remains at the biggest risk of a direct landfall, followed by Cape Lookout and Cape Fear in the Wilmington area. And I think it's going to move along as expected. We'll see if they increase it to a Cat 3, right? It's only 1 mile per hour off, but I don't much care about that. I know a lot of other people do. The impact should stay the same.
Yeah. What about Efren? What do you think?
I think the biggest thing that would surprise me is if it actually increases its forward motion and turns a little bit earlier. The guidance models, the spaghetti models, and the National Hurricane Center's cone has been relatively consistent over the last 24 hours. The biggest concern now is, when is it going to make its turn now that it's moving north at 8 miles an hour? If it slows down or doesn't speed up at all where it is now, or it turns later, regardless of whether it makes landfall anywhere along the South Carolina coastline or the South North Carolina Banks, I would be very surprised if it doesn't drop as much rain as a lot of the models are forecasting. I still do expect that it's going to be slower than what's being anticipated, regardless of when it turns. But I would be very surprised both if it speeds up and it doesn't drop as much rainfall as it's expecting.
Yeah. Jeff, what about you? I mean, what has been the biggest challenge, and what do you think is going to happen coming up tonight at 11?
The biggest challenge for us has been figuring out if the storm's going to be where, you guys talk about it being a relatively tight window, and it is when you consider still, a ways away. But for us, the difference between 30 miles east of Hatteras and 30 miles northwest of Hatteras is pretty significant. I mean, really significant. If it follows the H-war for the H-Mon, one of those has it coming up almost over the state line, North Carolina and Virginia, not within 10 or 15 miles of that. That's what I'll be watching for. I don't think it's going to do that. If people have been following along, amateur, meteorologists at home looking at, a lot of people do that now, go to the model pages, whatever. Those have been by far the farthest left with the storm the entire time. So the history of that is telling me that they're probably the outliers, and I'm hoping that continues to be the case. But that's something we'll probably watch most carefully.
And Brad, if I can just add to what Jeff's been saying and what Tim alluded to earlier, a lot of people get focused on that center red line. And the way this hurricane is moving, like Jeff said, just a deviation either to one side or another by as little as 25 to 30 miles would be the difference of a far larger impact exponentially versus virtually nothing at all. And that's a very important thing that a lot of our viewers in all of our viewing areas need to really understand, that don't concentrate on that red line. It can change in 1 hour, and that red line can shift either for the better or for the worse.
And what I'd like to add to that one thing, we've not only been emphasizing that's a great point, but the fact that only 2/3 of the time does the center even stay within the cone historically. I've been pointing that out to people, and I'm like, well, not, what if it's away over here? There's not only a small chance of that, there's a decent chance. So, both those points are just so valuable for people to understand.
Yeah, I've been thinking about the cone a lot lately, and I've seen some research papers on ways to depict it better. And I think that that's the one thing I could change going forward, is come up with a better way to talk about the track, because it's kind of like chance of rain. Everybody has their own definition of it. Everybody can see it, but not everybody is communicating it the same way and understanding it. So it's something we'll work for. And as people watching, one of the things I know we all struggle with, the science of meteorology is pretty amazing. We're really good at it. One of the things that's most difficult for us now is communicating the science to people. And that's something we all try to work hard on every day. And that's why we do, events like this, streaming, to try to explain things as best as possible. Now I'm going to let these guys go, because we've all got a lot of work tonight. We've got shows coming up and covering a lot of people. Thanks for joining us tonight, everybody. And make sure you're following all these guys online on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Go to their websites. I like local knowledge. Everyone asks me things, but please go to your local meteorologist. They know the area the best. They can give you the best information. So if you're in an area, try to find a local meteorologist that can give you local personalized information, and try to steer clear of those national apps. They don't do very good with these events. Take care, everybody.
All right, see ya.